Yes, there are police executions and police murders, and those are extreme and brutal. But I think the most hostile, toxic environment for people of color every day is unexamined whiteness.
A few months after the Coming Together, a call for action forum given by Evergreen in the fall of 2015, they hosted, in January of 2016, they hosted a series of lectures titled Coming Together, which I don't believe was intentionally a reference to circle jerking over far-left perspectives on the world, even though the only people that they invited and hosted were from the very far left of the spectrum on these issues. And one of the lectures that they invited was Robin DiAngelo, the inventor of the concept of white fragility, which is a beautiful word. Like, how do you get into people and really give them a rise, you know? Like, oh man, it's beautiful. She's a rhetorician of the highest degree. And what this video is about is going through and examining one of her lectures, her first lecture. And I want to show how her vocabulary and her way of looking at the world and her version of how the world is set up is synonymous and probably informs a lot of the staff and faculty, and therefore the students' ideas about the world and how to change the world. So here we go. This is from her lecture.
Well, I want to start out by drawing your attention to the fact that I'm white. I see the world through a white frame of reference. I have a white experience, and I'm always coming from that position in a society in which race has profound meaning for our lives. And I do invite people of color to hold me accountable, to challenge my analysis, to deepen my analysis. I don't actually invite white people to do that.
Oh, Robin Bobbin, I'm sorry. I'm gonna do that. I mean, I'm sorry if that offends you because of the pallor of my skin, but I'm not gonna silence myself with you. I'm gonna talk. Okay.
What I invite white people to do is to reach for humility and be willing to just grapple. And that right there is an interruption to what it means to be white, is to have humility in the face of racism, in the ways that we've been set up to collude with it.
I'm skeptical that an argument that requires somebody to ask a certain portion of the audience to not have any negative reaction about it. Maybe it's just a disease of mine having to do with some sort of characteristic that stains me all the time, that I think that your argument is already out the gate pretty suspicious.
But even though I am speaking as a white person primarily to other white people, this can still be very useful and often is really useful for people of color. Because I'm going to name and admit to things that white people will rarely ever name and admit to, and that can help a little bit with the crazy making. And you've got to navigate us, right? We are the problem, we are the gatekeepers, and nothing in society gives any of us the information we need to have a complex, nuanced understanding of race.
So nothing in society gives any of us the information we need to deal with racism in a nuanced manner. What about personal experience? What about people who do a lot of traveling? What about people who interact with people of different races, right? She's making a blanket statement about our entire society based on these anything and nothing statements, which is literally not nuanced whatsoever. Secondly, the word admit is very important. So she's not about to build an argument. She's not going to prove something. She's going to admit to something, which is a fundamentally different rhetorical device. If I say that I'm admitting something to you, and only to you, that you're never going to hear from anybody else, one, that virtue signals that I'm doing something righteous. I'm stepping out of the common mold as a service to you. And secondly, the form of admission, because it's not about proving anything, it has a personal flavor. And later on in this talk, she admits to being a Catholic.
I don't feel guilty. I'm not trying to make people feel guilty. I mean, if guilt motivates you, I'm okay with it. Okay? And as a good Catholic, it does motivate me. If guilt paralyzes you, then you can't indulge in it, because then it's just an excuse, right? It's just that it's incredibly transformative and liberating to just start from the premise that, yes, I have a deep investment in racism. The default is the reproduction of racism.
A lot of her dynamics actually are coming from Catholicism. There's a priestly caste, and then there's the vulgate, right? So there's the people who know things, and then there's the congregation, and then there's these articles of confession, and so she's putting on this confessorial kind of attitude. And also, again, her view of racism, because she divests it from the individual, she puts it on this societal level so that it's always saturating everything. Again, it's original sin. Following her Catholic upbringing, how do you get rid of the original sin is you're not necessarily forgiven so much as you do penance, and you do penance, and you do penance, and you do penance. So this penance in the first instance is humility. And speaking of the crazy making, that kind of like was driving me crazy too, because that's another of these phrases that she's so good at making, right? She's going to make so many more, I'm sure. The world is going to be filled with her isms. And I hope that they will be filled with mine too someday. But her crazy making idea comes from this paper that she wrote called Beyond the Face of Race, Emo-Cognitive Explorations of White Neurosis and Racial Cray-Cray, which in that they reference this other slightly more scholarly seeming essay called Am I Going Crazy? A Critical Race Analysis of Doctoral Education, which talks about the difficulties that persons of color, have in getting a doctorate degree. And in this essay, they speak about critical race theory. They even have an acronym of it. That's how instituted it is. It has an acronym. And about CRT, they say, by challenging dominant ideologies, critical race theory moves academic inquiry beyond frameworks of individual responsibility and success to discussions around the unexamined institutional and systematic factors that leave oppressive power dynamics intact. Supporting this move from individual to institutional and systemic responsibility, CRT often draws on narrative data to examine discursive understandings of lived experience. As such, CRT values the voices and experiences of those who are least heard in education, especially as they provide counter-understandings to dominant ideologies. In this way, a critical race perspective illuminates the ways dominant ideologies manifest in social narratives. So she's on board with this. And it's all about the group. It's all about the group, to the detriment of the individual.
And for my very limited time with you, I'm going to be speaking about it in the big, big picture, right? White and people of color, right? The big binary, because I think on some level we can recognize that society is set up in that binary. But in doing that, I'm also going to not do justice to all the complexity and nuance in those categories, right? So to have what I think of as racial fluency, you also have to break down this big category, people of color, and really understand how kind of different groups get assigned different roles, and then how we all kind of hook together.
So she makes this large binary. It's very important to her to make this large binary, and you section off the scapegoats or whatever, the negative caste, and then you have this other caste, and then that other caste has all these other smaller castes and smaller castes and smaller castes and smaller castes, and she really stresses the group. The group gets finer and finer and finer and finer and finer, and what does that do? What does that do? It never actually leads to an actual individual. It just keeps on breaking you down and breaking you down and breaking you down, and you have to figure out that there's more and more difference in the world. With this way of looking at the world, there's more and more and more and more difference between people, and that's one of the reasons why this group and this ideology loathes the term I don't see race, loathes individuality, loathes universalism. It kind of, I'm going to say, it takes the wind out of their sails in a way, because they can no longer use all that tension between all these differences to erect their grand argument, which is revolution or change or justice or equity or whatever. It relies on the tension between groups in order to function. Anti-oppression, like I said, or anti-racism. It requires racism. It requires oppression. It requires negativity in order to operate. And that's integral to the narrative. And that's why it uses white guilt. guilt. It runs off of white guilt, and it runs off of the thirst for revenge of the people that they cast as oppressed. That's how it operates, fundamentally.
Nobody, really agrees with racism anymore, and yet we still have racism. In other words, by every single measure across every institution, our society is separate and unequal by race. So my question as a sociologist is, how do we pull that off? How do we manage post-civil rights when racism is no longer acceptable and yet we have these same outcomes? So that's what I try to look at. It's transformed, but it's a brilliant and highly adaptive system. And it does adapt to challenges and incorporate those challenges. And so we have to be ever vigilant. We can't be complacent.
That really reminds me of Jordan B. Peterson. There's this rather popular tirade that he makes against postmodernism and how we need to be ever vigilant against this thing because it's tenacious and it's this complex system that's ever adapting. And I think it's true with racism, and I think it's true with critical theory or Marxism or all these different things. It's going to keep on morphing and keep on morphing and keep on morphing. But what is morphing underneath that? What is it underneath that?
We will often use prejudice, discrimination, and racism interchangeably, and they're not the same things. So quickly, prejudice is prejudgment, how you think and feel. All human beings have prejudice about other groups of human beings to which they don't belong. It's not humanly possible not to have prejudice. We're getting messages all around us 24/7. And we can make sense of these messages because they connect to messages that have gone before. And discrimination is when we act on those messages. And it's actually not possible to not act on your prejudice, right? In other words, you cannot prevent yourself from discriminating based on your prejudice. And think about it like this. The way you see the world informs the way you respond to the world. So the only way you can really stop yourself from discriminating is to be able to identify your prejudice and then work with changing your understanding, right? Kind of re-educate yourself.
This is solid. I agree with this. There's stuff that's inside of us that's informing us, like information gets in and it makes a prejudice, it makes a sort of categorization that we operate within, and then we act according to that. We act out what we believe. That's true. She's concentrating only on the negative, only on discrimination and prejudice. She's not talking about virtue. She doesn't want to talk about virtue. If the oppressive class got there by any other means than oppressing the oppressed class, then this whole dynamic is really suspect. But if they got there by no virtue of their own, then you get to dismantle everything that society is founded on. You get to dismantle all the virtues. You get to toss out everything, even individuality, even individual people, because nothing in that system has come from anything good. It's come at the expense of another system. This is another fundamental flaw with the argument. It's another fundamental flaw that I take issue with. Do I sound offensive?
So everybody has prejudice, everybody discriminates. But when you back a group's collective prejudice with control of all of the institutions, you transform it into something very different. Now the very society, the fabric, the default of the society will reproduce the discrimination without individual actors needing to do anything at all. Right? It's not dependent on each individual person because the group that holds the power and the control of the institutions embeds its prejudice into the institutions, into the fabric or the very water of the society. So you can think of it as prejudice plus group power, or prejudice backed by legal authority and institutional control. It gets embedded in all the institutions and also in cultural definitions of what's real, what's normal, what's beautiful, what's valuable, what's correct, who behaves correctly, whose stories aren't told, and whose stories are, and who gets to make those decisions.
She's saying, okay, we're going to move away from the individual, and we're going to talk about the system, and she goes on and talks about the patriarchy, because the patriarchy led to this. If she's moving towards an institutional critique, then she wants to make institutional change. And what exactly does that look like? Well, if she requires that white people silence themselves in order for this all to happen, then probably at some point that institution is going to need to treat white people in a certain way and treat people who are not white in another way. Like, this is all based on Marxism, right? And what happened in communist China was that there's these things called the struggle sessions, which are very much identical to what happened at Evergreen. There were these what the students did was they took these figures of authority and they shamed them and shamed them and shamed them in order to get some sort of confession out of them. So we already see that if Marxism, when implemented in China, led to that, and these ideas implemented in Evergreen led to that. And there's a lot of structural coincidence between Marxism and this critical race theory and this intersectionality stuff. Is it not going to produce the same thing that communism produced when you keep on instituting that and instituting that and instituting that? And why is that? That's the question I want to ask. What is it about this narrative that leads to these outcomes?
Now, what's so powerful about this is now I'm in the position to socialize everyone's children. I get to decide who's smart, who's capable, who's well-behaved, who's respectful, who belongs in special ed, who should be punished for what. And on every measure, you see the outcome. The school-to-prison pipeline. Seattle's in big trouble over their outcomes. And so it's not about individual people and their intentions. It's about this segregation and then what we've absorbed and then the way that manifests in our practices. Right? And then you add, make it so bad to have racist ideas and attitudes that no one wants to look at it. That was a clever adaptation. Okay. These are our best and brightest, again, certified as highly educated. I mean, they're college champions, so they're pretty smart. And this is the board at the end of the champion round. And as we can see, there's a column that not one of them touched. Obviously, the hardest, none of them wanted to lose. For me, that would be astrophysics, chemistry, right? To be really honest, it could be algebra, but let's see what it is. And I don't really know how to capture the profundity of this. If we don't know our history, we cannot address racism. It is the bedrock of this country. It is hundreds and hundreds of years of plunder. It is as critical to how I come to be standing here as to understand how African Americans in this case are standing where they're standing. It is our shared history. It shapes all of our identity. And the more we lose touch with it, the less we're going to be able to address this.
Okay, I need to repeat this, that she has a lot of good points, and I don't take issue with a lot of her issues that she's taking issue with. I take issue with the way in which she's issuing her issues to be issues. That's my issue. But with regards to history, it's very important. History is absolutely essentially important. But how do you organize history? How do you take history and build upon it? How do you go forward? And how you view history, in order to be supple and nimble, you need to have some sort of bearing. You need to have a master narrative. My question is oppression the best story available in order to help people who are down below? And is oppression the best story to teach those who are up above? Because what I see is that oppression, by way of white guilt, is being used to at least lower the esteem, the self-esteem, and the faith in their culture of these people on top. And it does give a sense of being raised up by the people who are oppressed, who watch these people sink down low. But it doesn't actually raise people up. Because if you look at it narratively, if you look at it as a story, what are the options given to someone who works within a framework of oppressor and oppressed? If you are taught that you are the oppressed, what are your options? What are the kind of the character roles that you can play? You end up playing the victim or the hoodlum, or in a sense, the tyrant, right? It limits your freedom. And it also needs to be fueled by oppression. You need to find oppression. And if you can't find it out in the open, you need to look smaller and smaller and smaller, because your whole narrative is running off of oppression. And this is not to say that oppression isn't a reality. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not discrediting oppression in and of itself or saying that injustice does occur. I'm wondering if putting so much stress, if basing your entire life on oppression is going to actually free you from oppression. And I'm wondering if we want to lift people up instead of tearing other people down. And instead of justifying somebody's low status, if we give them access to a way of building a story that gives them different roles to play within society. I'm talking about generic tropes, right? Instead of victim, they can be a hero, or they can be an inventor, or they can be all these other tropes, right? That we assign to all these other stereotypes of whiteness or Western culture or geek culture or Asian culture. Every culture has got these stereotypes. And where do these stereotypes come from? It's that there's a framework within which individuals operate. And then within that operation, they manifest certain characteristics that we then get to make fun of. So in order to give somebody access to the ability to tell a better story about their lives, what I'm proposing is that we de-emphasize oppression. Not say it doesn't count, but de-emphasize it in order to give a sense of empowerment that doesn't come at the cost of justice or revenge or tearing other people down. When I came to Evergreen, I heard a lot about empowering people, and I kept on thinking, empowerment without etiquette is just a license to be a tyrant. If you're given all this power but you don't know how to wield it, you're going to wield it willy-nilly, and it's going to be destructive as well as creative, right? So I want to go in and say, okay, yes, there's equality of opportunity, and I think that the progressives have a valid point and say, well, what about equality of outcome? What about that? What about equality of outcome? And I think everybody's actually concerned with that. It's just how do you ensure that? And I think if we look at it from a narrative standpoint, you say, okay, well, in a narrative standpoint, what is power? What is a powerful character? A powerful character basically has there's two kind of channels, or two aspects to a powerful character. There's the opportunity or the capability. So a character is able to act, and the character's actions have an effect, right? So that's basically opportunity. And then there's the capacity of the character, right? There's the ability for the character to not only to act, but when they act, they actually are able to manifest and to take advantage of that action when they get there. And how do you institute capability? Well, it really has to do with education. It has to do with personal responsibility, and that goes all the way back into childhood. It goes all the way back into the father and the mother relationship. There's this little actant, this little baby who isn't able to do anything, and is slowly given more and more responsibility to take care of themselves, right? And so there's these different containers, right? And the womb-like container, the traditional mother, gives access to certain sorts of responsibility and certain sorts of nurturing, and then there's a stereotypical father aspect that is a little bit more harder on the kid to get the kid ready for that outward environment. And the problem with equality of outcome is that as things fall out, some people are going to get better and some people are going to have it worse. And yes, we can do better with the opportunity, but the capacity has to come from some sort of narrative that is based on the self, that's based on the actant, that no, I refuse to be oppressed. I refuse to be a victim or a hoodlum or whatever. Instead, I am going to go forth and take all these difficulties that I have and walk up that very steep hill I have. And everybody has a steep hill, and some people have a steeper hill than others, but you don't want to level the whole land. You don't want to level the whole land, because what you do when you level the land is that all that effort that goes into rising up, you're taking that from somebody. And so they no longer own their own capacity. Their capacity is not gotten to by their own agency. Right? And you undermine agency when you promise or when you try to institute some sort of equality of outcome. And that is kind of my critique of D'Angelo. And I have a link to her full 3 talks. And they're very worth checking out. Even if you disagree with her, she does some brilliant things with how she makes her argument so salient, and how she gets everybody to think this way, which I think is eventually going to lead to absolute madness. At least it did. At least it did.